Good afternoon to you. Mark 7th, HurricaneTrack.com here with your off-season edition of the Hurricane Outlook and Discussion. It is now Monday, the 12th day of April 2021. I am in Orlando, Florida. This is my hotel room. You can see behind me. I'm down here working with some of my colleagues as we get ready for hurricane season. And as the graphic says, hurricane season is coming. We need to be thinking about it more. We're doing our part to get ready. And we're going to be doing some incredible things this year, continuing the tradition of incredible things. And I want you to be ready for the season ahead. So let's get on with it, shall we? Let's see what we got going on out there. First, a satellite animation here, the Western Hemisphere. Nice visible shot. Not hurricane season yet. There's very limited, in fact, almost no convection down in the tropics just yet. But give it a few more weeks and we're going to start to see that percolate just a little bit more. Right now, pretty good trade winds blowing through from east to west, and then in the upper levels of the atmosphere, as you can see, we have westerly winds. And I'll show you this a little later on in the presentation today. We have a volcano that has become active down here on the island of St. Vincent, and we can look at that on a close-up here in a minute. I'm sure you've heard all about it, and I'll talk about why that will not really impact any sensible weather other than for the area down there. Barbados certainly being impacted, St. Vincent, of course, but it's not the type of situation that's going to like cool the global temperatures or anything like that, and I will discuss why in more detail in just a moment. So let's go on to the Current Anomalies Map. Wow, this is starting to get concerning once again. Why? Well, we have the cool Pacific look over here, and then the very warm look to the Atlantic basin. In fact, this region right up here off the coast of Africa, the northwest coast here near the Canary Islands and off the coast of Portugal, this has warmed rather substantially over the last 10 days or so. And the Canary Current that runs along here, there's no cold water over there for it to transport south. In fact, the water temperatures are warmer here, at least anomaly-wise, than they are to the south. And so the pattern is getting set up here inside of, we're just about 45 days away. We'll just round it and call it 45 days away from the start of hurricane season. Now we know that this area doesn't really get active until, well, hopefully not until July or August, late July into August, but you never know. We certainly do have these positive anomalies, water temperatures warmer than they should be, or the long-term average. Who's to say what they should be, right? And even the Gulf of Mexico here has warmed up considerably relative to average. The Bay of Campeche, except for this one little island right there that I'll circle in blue, the Gulf of Mexico running above the long-term average. And then you compare that to the La Nina. It's weakened a little bit. It's come off of its peak over the winter months, but we still definitely have a colder than average Pacific, the ENSO regions as we call it, El Nino Southern Oscillation. And so that is why, at least partially, we are seeing these forecasts from different groups, different agencies, private, public, university, whatever, and there's a lot more forecasts coming out. It's amazing how many people do these. And just as a side note, I don't do seasonal hurricane predictions myself because I don't really have much skill with that. I think you can just look and see if there's no El Nino and the Atlantic is warmer than average, you should have a fairly active season. That's generally the rule of thumb, and anybody can just look at that and figure it out just using these charts right here. It's really going to come down to where they go, how strong will they be when they get there, if they hit land. And nobody knows that this far out with any great detail. But this kind of pattern is why we're seeing some of these forecasts calling for a very busy Atlantic hurricane season once it gets here, starting in June, hopefully not before. This is interesting. This came out today. I saw this over at storm2k.org. One of the frequent posters there mentioned this, did a screen capture from the latest CPC update. Climate Prediction Center does like an El Nino diagnostic discussion, or ENSO, and the El Nino Southern Oscillation phenomenon. And what we're seeing over the last few months, we had this La Nina, dipped down to below a degree Celsius, and we've moderated it in recent weeks. But it looks like the mean here, that dashed line, headed back towards cool conditions in the Pacific there. Now I've highlighted it in blue. We should be headed back towards La Nina by September or so. September, October, November, somewhere in that time frame. And if I can zoom in on this graphic, let's do that. I want to show you what it's predicting. This is the CFS V2, by the way, the climate forecast system. It is the American-based climate model, just to put it in very simple terms. So let's look out at the time frame of August, September, October, which is right here. If I can draw a straight line, I feel like I'm back in kindergarten. Keep it in the lines. It's hard to do sometimes with a mouse and a pad, but it worked out pretty good. So here's the time frame we're looking at for the peak of hurricane season, basically right through here. We can just kind of color it in. These are your peak months. And the CFS and its ensemble members here, the overall envelope, none of them showing El Nino conditions. None of them. And that's really important. So I'm going to do it again in blue just to kind of show you here. Half a degree Celsius or so, maybe a little warmer is considered El Nino, a half a degree on the positive side. On the negative side, that's La Nina. So we go back to La Nina territory, according to the CFS here, by August, September, October. Why is that important? Because, ladies and gentlemen, that is the peak of hurricane season. You should know that by now. So that is concerning. That tells us the base state, the background state of the ocean and the atmosphere should kind of work in concert with each other to give us a busier than average Atlantic hurricane season. And then it really is going to matter, obviously, where does whatever happens to form end up? And we don't know the answers to that. So that's why you have to stay tuned to this video update every week or every day once we get to the season. Right? Right. All right. So moving away from anomalies, which is what this is, these are anomalies. These are actual sea surface temperatures. I like to keep an eye on this to see how water temperatures are progressing. And remember, almost the entire Gulf, I'll just go back real quick, is running above the long-term average, right? You see it right there in the middle. Draw your attention to it. It's all red and orange and yellow in there. Just one little pocket of blue, some cooler anomalies, but otherwise everything's running above the long-term average. Well, what are the actual temperatures? These are in degrees Celsius. 26 Celsius is regarded as usually the baseline for getting tropical activity. And as I outline it in blue here, yeah, it's a fairly sizable area of the Gulf that is already warmed up to that sort of magic threshold. Yeah, it's going to take a while. It's only getting close to mid-April. In another month, pretty much the whole Gulf will be primed and ready to go. It'll be a matter of, does anything come along to take advantage of that? It's a process, we know that. But it is running a little bit ahead of schedule, as we can tell by the anomalies here. Especially in the central Gulf. Look at that. Talking about maybe 2 degrees Celsius warmer than we would expect it to see, and that's generally in this area right through here. So, just keeping an eye on it, see how things progress. Could make a difference as we get into May, as we keep watching severe weather, that kind of stuff, and any early tropical activity. Of course, that could take advantage of warmer than average temperatures in the Gulf. What about the East Coast and the New England states and vicinity? Still a little bit chilly for my liking, as you would expect this time of year. But what about the anomalies? Let's just compare the shelf water right up against the coast for the southeast, still running a tad cooler than it should be, but everything else just offshore, including the Gulf of Maine up here, is definitely warmer than the long-term average. And when we look at the actual temperatures, that equates to temperatures basically in the 40s and 50s up north, 60s and 70s down south, and especially in the Gulf Stream, close to 80 degrees. But we usually don't see tropical activity in the northwest Atlantic early in the season. Any tropical or subtropical mischief usually gets started in the Gulf or maybe the southwest Atlantic. But nevertheless, temperatures going up as we would expect, Nothing that we haven't seen really out of the ordinary. I will say this. Since about 2015, at the end of the last major El Nino, the Atlantic has generally remained warm, and the Pacific has kind of oscillated towards going back colder again, what we call the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, the PDO, and now it is pretty firmly negative, while the Atlantic is generally positive. And again, that's another reason why we're expecting a fairly active hurricane season compared to the averages. All right, so one thing I want to, before we get to that, I want to show you something else directly related to sort of current events. Where are we? Well, this is the Western Pacific. Haven't shown you this in a long time. This would be the east coast of China, as an example. There is Taiwan. Here's Japan and its various islands that make up Japan. The Philippines down this way. And we're looking at the 850 millibar section of the atmosphere. And if you're new to my video, this is my favorite layer to look at when we are looking for trouble, when we are looking for something to develop. This is what I like. It's about 5,000 feet up in the atmosphere, and we're looking for spin or vorticity, the way that the Earth turns and you get counterclockwise rotation for low pressure in the northern hemisphere, and that starts to tighten up. You can see that in the modeling by way of what we call vorticity. And the more of that there is, the faster the wind is blowing, the more energy is obvious, I guess you would say, in the modeling. And you can measure that using math and physics. It's very difficult to explain, but that's why these maps are so nice, especially like what Levi has coded up here at tropicaltidbits.com, because you can see it as it gets stronger and more robust. That's the good word to use here. So that's what we're looking for, and I bring this up because this area right through here, you got some spin down here. You can see those wind barbs, and as I outlined it there, it generally looks like counterclockwise rotation, but it's very, very broad right now. But what's going to happen, and we've seen people talk about this on Twitter and elsewhere lately, this is going to coalesce and kind of come together and develop deep convection, so forth and so on, well to the east of the Philippines. This is 3 days out, and you see what's happening. It turns into a bona fide typhoon at some point here and moves off to the northwest and then north eventually, gets caught up in the westerlies, and off it goes. We're talking more than 10 days out. Could it threaten the Philippines? I suppose it could, but there's not a lot of ridging out here to the north of it, just like we look for in the Atlantic, to steer it west into the Philippine Sea and into the Philippines. I don't see that happening yet, but that doesn't mean that it can't happen. The interesting thing about this is that it's taking advantage of a favorable Madden-Julian oscillation that's trying to get going, some westerly winds down there. Let's go back to the beginning of the animation, if you will, the time period. And you can see at basically the current position here, you have these westerly winds coming across at these low latitudes, the northerly trades up here, and so you get that turning. And it's this westerly feed that has a little bit of, generated a little bit of interest from some folks that think that this might help to trigger enough westerly wind anomalies. The winds are usually supposed to come east to west. That's the trade winds. That this might try to set off a trend towards knocking a boulder downhill, if you will. That's my analogy here, to get the El Nino going. But I don't think that's going to happen because this is not at a lower latitude. Usually your westerly wind bursts, as we call it, or your westerly wind anomalies, need to take place closer to about 5 degrees latitude for between 0 and 5 degrees north latitude, the equator being 0 latitude, of course, for a sustained period of time. And what we see with this developing typhoon is it lifts north and kind of gets out of there, and the westerly winds are really confined to this one area, several hundred miles east of the Philippines. Back to the east, the winds are coming from the east. So I just don't think this is going to be enough to overwhelm the pattern and kind of kick that boulder down the hill, so to speak, to get a landslide towards an El Nino. So you know what? Let's check this out right here. This was updated on April 12th. Let's look at this in 2 weeks. So 2 weeks from today, towards the end of April, let's see if the CFS, which will quote-unquote know all about that typhoon, it'll be part of its ingested initial data within the next couple of weeks. Let's see if it affects some of the later plumes that are going to come out. These are called plumes over here. And let's see if it does have any bearing on potentially changing the pattern. I don't think it will, but there was a little bit of talk about it. I wanted to just bring that up. Other than the fact that it looks like we're going to have a strong typhoon in the western Pacific, and then it may get caught up in the westerlies, as I talked about, and that energy gets up into the mid-latitudes, and it can do all sorts of interesting things. We'll talk about that later. Right now, it's still in its formative stages. All right, now, going back to what we look for the upcoming hurricane season, this is something that I discussed last week, I think it was Friday, with our Patreon crowdfunding group. We now do exclusive Zoom chats where we get our members together and I host a Zoom meeting. We all know about Zoom now, thanks to the pandemic, and I've become familiar with it, and we went over this Friday, so now I want to discuss it with you guys, and that is these analogs, all right? We saw, if you noticed the forecast last week from Dr. Klotzbach, that he talks about these analog years. What years have similar patterns to what we're seeing so far in 2021? And Dr. Klotzbach and his colleagues selected these analog years, 96, 01, 08, 11, and 17. Now, I mentioned this briefly in my update last week on Thursday, but I wanted to go into more detail like I did on Friday with our crowdfunding folks, and that is, let's look at these individual seasons. Here's 1996. We had a couple of hits in North Carolina, some down in the Northeast Caribbean in terms of significant hurricane impacts. 2001, not nearly as impactful for the United States. No hurricanes hit that year, which was a good thing. We had other things we were dealing with. Obviously, in the fall of 2001, we did have major, and I mean big-time, Hurricane Michelle in November of all months coming out of the Northwest Caribbean in 2001, but there was relatively little impact from tropical cyclones for the U.S. that year. What about 2008? That was a big impact year. Most people don't really remember it unless they live in some of these areas, Louisiana, Texas for Ike, and then down in the Caribbean, it was a pretty big year, but the collapse of the U.S. economy and some other political stuff going on that year kind of made the 08 hurricane season less memorable for most Americans. They were focused on other problems. But believe me, 08, that was a big year. I mean, look at that long track Hurricane Ike there that had that bend back in the track. And then it made I goofed it up. It made landfall, up there in the upper Texas coast. I was there for it. That was a big deal. So 08 sticks out. Finally, 2011, most of the traffic, if you will, that year congregated well east of the United States, which was, a good thing, because if you move this over just a few hundred miles, it's a big problem. It was already bad enough with Irene, but Irene didn't quite live up to its expectations, as bad as it was. So 11, very busy, but it could have been worse, as they say. And then the one that really stands out, and it's the most memorable for us in recent times, is 2017. These 5 analog years, with the exception of 01, are all very impactful. And that tells us we need to really pay attention to this, that the forecast that has been issued from Dr. Klotzbach last week, indicating an above-average season, a higher than normal chance of a major hurricane hitting the U.S., all these factors, I'm telling you, I know we've had a heck of a year plus now, but we have to start thinking about hurricanes again. And that's not fear-mongering. That is not trying to hype anything. It's a simple fact that every year we have hurricanes to deal with, one way or the other. Shipping interests deal with them out in the ocean, so this matters even if they all stay out to sea. People watch my videos, they look at the Hurricane Center forecast, the Tropical Analysis and Forecast branch of the National Weather Service. It all matters to mariners, to people living in the islands, to the U.S. mainland residents, and everything in between. So I'm just reminding you, it's almost here, and we have a lot of really, really good tools to keep track of it, all right? And that's a positive. Let's think positive about this. And, you know, if something nasty comes along and we got to deal with it, we'll deal with it. And we'll make sure people know. But for now, the signals are there for it to be another busy season. And I want to help you do the best that I can using my 2 decades plus of experience and keep you ahead of the game. All right, real quick, looking at lower 48 weather. Nice product here from Pivotal Weather. Kind of breaking everything down. Luckily, for the most part, the U.S. is fairly clear of any major troubles right now, weather-wise. All these little green splotches you see in here are various and sundry flood warnings along rivers. This would be some wind advisory kind of stuff. But other than that, no big severe weather problems coming up anytime soon, at least on a widespread basis. And we can look at the Spc Outlook panel here, again off of the Pivotal Weather website. Slight risk today in parts of west central Texas, but then it really kind of calms down. Just general thunderstorm activity over the next few days, no big deal, which is great for this time of the year. And a big reason behind this, if we go back, if it'll let me, come on, a big reason behind this is because the pattern is just not that favorable for severe weather right now. We have cold, generally relative to average in the nation's midsection, warm out to the west, and just the way the pattern is set up, it's not that conducive. We don't have a lot of, I mean, once you get a bunch of warm air down in this region and then cooler air trying to come in and battle with that, the cold air is already in place relative to average. That's not going to work, and that's good. That keeps the severe weather at bay, but just looking at the precip coming up, kind of dry. Maybe a little bit over the next few days in parts of New Mexico, West Texas, and the southeast, favoring Florida. But the 2-week forecast, especially out in the west, where the drought is becoming more and more concerning. But even the nation's midsection here, this is just, it's not good. It's headed towards drier and drier, which is a trademark of La Nina, to be honest with you. Not unexpected, but it's not a good look if you thinking about heat and dryness and drought and all that kind of stuff. Sometimes bad weather can bring positive consequences, if you will. Those consequences can be a good thing. So I saw this interesting tweet earlier, the volcano down in the St. Vincent area, and I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm not going to try. But it's really interesting to see that the GOES satellite can pick this up with the various channels that it has, and this is looking at about a 2+ day animation here from the volcanic eruptions. And what's happening is the cloud plume is reaching so high in the atmosphere that it's showing up as colder temperatures in the infrared channels, which is utterly fascinating, if not terrifying, because I mean it's a freaking volcano, and that's bigger than you and me, right? There's Barbados over to the east, in case you didn't know. We got some friends down there in Barbados, so let me hear from you. How's the ashfall going? It's probably not very pleasant down there, I would imagine. But why is this not going to be a big deal in terms of changing the pattern, so to speak? One, it's not very large. You remember back in 1991, if you heard about it, if you were alive back then, Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines had an enormous eruption. And it was down in the tropics, similar to this volcano. But it was just huge, massive eruption, and it put a tremendous amount of aerosols, that's the term for it, into the stratosphere, which circled the globe and actually helped to cool the Earth's temperature just a little bit of a veil almost like a nuclear winter. I hate saying that, but that's what it was similar to. And it was a large eruption. As interesting as this is, and as impactful as it is, certainly for the people down in the Caribbean, this is a smaller eruption. So you're not putting as much. Now, if this just keeps going and going and going for months, maybe. What's going to be interesting, and I say maybe it could have some changes, especially locally. You might have some cooler sea surface temperatures in the area to the east of the Leeward Islands, maybe, if there's enough ash going by day to day. But what's really going to be interesting is to see when we get tropical waves and maybe even hurricane activity, maybe if this keeps going. Can you imagine a hurricane coming through here, or just a potent tropical wave while there's an eruption going on? That could be a real big problem for our friends down here in St. Vincent. So we'll keep an eye on that going forward. All right, I am in Orlando, as I mentioned. I'm working with a couple of our partners through the Patreon HurricaneTrack Insider universe that we have created here over the last few years, part of our crowdfunding effort to do some incredible things. And I'm going to put together a video once I get back from all this travel, really going in depth at what we're doing. And I got to get your mindset away from thinking that this is a sales pitch. It's more of a, hey, look, we are building something absolutely incredible, have done it for almost 15 years now. It's just these last few years have taken incredible leaps because of the crowdfunding. And I want to put together a video where I thoroughly explain what we're doing, kind of take you behind the scenes, show you some of the things we've been working on, and then get you involved. Because this is more, it's interesting how the white screen lights me up better. It's more than just a membership. I know it says membership level, but think about it as an investment in the future of the project, and it's this sort of yin-yang of you help me, I help you kind of deal with a wonderful community. And that's what I'm doing in Florida. I'm working with several of the people that I have met over the years because of all of this. And we're all working together. We have people from all across the world helping out, literally, I mean quite literally, to build this into the greatest hurricane coverage that you will find online, and maybe even better than anything you see on television. I dare say that, but I think what we're going to be hatching and expanding upon this year could rival that. So that's where it is. It's at Patreon. The link to sign up is in the description of this video and pretty much every video over the last year or so. But we really are working on some cool stuff that'll give you tools, interactivity, kind of link us all together, and we have to fund it somehow. I'm not independently wealthy. We don't have $1 billion sitting in a trust fund somewhere. We're still waiting on that. But until that day comes, that word crowd of crowdfunding is what it's all about. So if you want to get involved, hurricane season's coming. Now's a good time to take a look at it. And like I said, when I get back, I'll put together an in-depth video and show you what we're doing and try to convince you that this is something that'll benefit you, it'll benefit the science, it'll help advance the science, and you can be a part of it and join the crowdfunding effort. That's what it is. All right? All right. Well, as always, Mondays are usually lengthy because we go over a lot. You saw I had a lot of tabs up there. So I appreciate your time and attention. That will about do it for me. I am Mark Sudduth for HurricaneTrack.com. From Orlando, Florida, I'll talk to you again next Monday.